Good morning, everybody. Thanks for still being here. uh, Before we start, let me just one administrative issue. There will be more announcement later on. I don't want to take time now from the session. As you've noticed, we're recording all of the sessions. And the institute usually puts them on the institute website. Okay, it's not the most frequently visited website in the world. So, but still, if anybody has an objection or does not want his or her talk or something to be put on, please let me know. Okay, we don't have to make this public, but approach me and let me know. Okay, and with this, I'm handing the torch to Shanghai and to the Sanskritists.
All right, so this morning we have the pleasure again of returning to the world of Sanskritic learning, and that's after 2 or 3 days of this very extended trip in southern India and then also other parts of Asia. So I believe today's speakers, all three of them, require no introduction for people who are in the field, but just for the sake of everyone, I would say, so our first speaker is Lawrence McCrea, and his talk is Dandin and the Kashmiris. Thank you.
That's good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Yigal and David and Charlie and everybody else who has made this conference possible. It's been a really fascinating few days. I always feel a little bit out of place at this sort of event. You know, I'm in some ways not quite ready to jump on the Dandin bandwagon. But I have a whole country of people behind me who are also reluctant to jump on the bandwagon, namely the people of Kashmir, at least in the classical period of Kashmiri aesthetics. And I want to try to talk about what the engagement is with Dandin in Kashmir. This is a situation where most of the time Dandin is totally ignored, at least overtly. But I think it can be demonstrated that pretty much everybody knew him and knew him extremely well, and he really was present to people's minds even when he was not being directly referenced. And I think this can be demonstrated with some examples that I will show you as we progress. And I will leave the evidence for later, but in general, why should this be the case? So it's obviously, it's not, and I'll show you that it's not the case that Dandin was forgotten, but most of the time he is off the map. And I want to talk about why that's the case, but also why he is selectively and by a couple people more seriously engaged. I talked about this a little bit at the Dandin in the World Madison event a couple years ago, and I don't want to rehearse it in detail, partly because I think it's been superseded by some of what's been said here by Andrew and by other people. But I think there's a general consensus that Kashmiri aesthetics, beginning with Udbata right around 800, takes a turn toward a sort of consumer-oriented rather than producer-oriented perspective, that it becomes much more and more about the epistemology of poetic experience. How from reading text you get certain content, both explicit and implicit. So there's a great attention to semantics, to exact processes by which information is conveyed. There's a much different and for the most part more intense integration with grammar and mimamsa and kind of cognitive theory more generally, I will say. And I think there's a comparative de-emphasis on kind of the wealth and this sort of proliferating, these kind of rich proliferating examples that are kind of this open-endedness that Yigal spoke of on Monday. I think, as I said at the time, that there's a countervailing tendency to want to close everything down and pin everything down. That's all right. To pin everything down as exactly and precisely as possible, precisely to form definitions that exactly determine the thing they're supposed to do and don't allow any scope for variation or expansion. I spoke at the Madison conference about how if you look at, for example, Udbata's and Dandin's typology of the simile, in Dandin you see, you see some things like you can have in compound or out of compound and things like this, but also you have a lot of things about not really how the simile functions cognitively, but the way it's used pragmatically. So you'll have similes used to convey praise or blame, sort of predicative or prohibitive or negative similes. Whereas if you look at Udbata's typology, it's about whether you can convey similes with an iva, without an iva. If it's in a compound, what exactly can be left out? There are circumstances in which you can leave out 1, 2, or 3 of the more basic kind of logical components of the simile. The upamana, the upameya, the thing you're talking about, the upameya, the thing you're comparing it with, the upamana, the particle that expresses comparison, like or as, and the word expressing the common property that's the basis for the simile. So he's very interested, and later Kashmiri authors expand this considerably. He's very interested in exactly what elements out of that foursome can be left out under what circumstances grammatically. He's interested in exactly what Paninian suffixes can be used to express similitude and what the limitations on their use are. So I tried to argue at the time that that Udbata's analysis, kind of by its nature, much more closely tied to the specific expressive mechanics of Sanskrit in a way that it could not have, it would be very weird and really impossible to translate that or adapt that into Tamil or Kannada or some other, non-Indic language, even more so. So I think there is this general move in simply a different direction, so that even when people are aware of Dandin, and even when they are in some respects sympathetic to him, and occasionally quote him as, usually with one exception, not as an authority, but as a kind of parallel evidence for some of the phenomena they explore, there's not a systematic interest in him by and large. Let me just briefly survey. I tried to really kind of exhaustively identify all quotations and named references to Dandin in kind of, Kashmir from 800 till Ruyiko, 1150 or whatever what I say that is. And I may have missed something, but I think I've been pretty thorough. And with only 2 exceptions, there are 2 authors, Kuntaka and this fellow Sahadeva, who you're probably not familiar with, but I'll tell you about in a bit, who engage him substantially, and they have half a dozen or more named references or quotations. But in no other work could I find more than 2 explicit references to Dandin. And just to look at them very quickly, Abhinavagupta, not talking about alankaras, but talking about the theory of rasa, toward the opening of his classic, his most elaborate discussion of rasa in his commentary in the Natya Shastra, he goes through these 4 views on what rasa is that are arranged in a kind of evolutionary order for him. The first is that rasa belongs to the character, and it's simply a kind of intensification of the character's emotion. So you and I ordinarily experience love, but Rama experiences Shringara rasa when love rises to a certain pitch, his love. Then, I don't want to go into the details because it's not really relevant to my talk, but then there's the idea that rasa doesn't really exist anywhere, but it's inferred to exist in the actor or the speaker of a verse in a poem. Then there's the idea that rasa is either somehow generated, bhavita, in a spectator. So rasa is your emotion, and there's a dispute which I won't get into because it's technical and probably spurious in a way between Abhinavagupta and one earlier theorist who both agree that rasa is in the spectator, but they disagree about the process by which this happens. I won't go into any more than that, those of you who are unfamiliar with it. But at any rate, when he's dealing with the first of those, the view that rasa is the intensified emotion of the character, he gives a longish summary of the views of this fellow Lolata, whom we know only through his summary, a Natya Shastra commentator. But then he very briefly notes that this is also the view of Dandin. And he describes Dandin here as a chirantana. And he says that you can show in Dandin's text that this is Dandin's view. And he doesn't actually quote Dandin's definition of rasavat, which we'll talk about a little later. But he quotes sort of 2 explanations that Dandin gives of his verses where he illustrates Shringara and Raudra, where in both cases he gives an example, and then he says afterward that here the love or the kolpa, the anger, is increased to a certain intensity and therefore becomes rasa. Right, so actually he has a very good case. But for him, the very fact that Dandin has this view marks him as a Chirantana, as a sort of archaic view, which has now been surpassed by evolving views of Rasa. And that's all he has to say about Dandin. Two very brief quotations there. So then, very briefly, there's a fellow named Induraja, Pratihara Induraja, who I've written about, who is the earliest of all these citations I'm going to give. He's early 900s, and he's a pupil of this fellow named Mukulabhatta that I'm very interested in. I've written about. Other people are getting rather interested in him now. And he was a kind of, in a certain sense, a kind of neo-traditionalist, that he's responding to this new theory of literary suggestion that was produced by Anandavardhana in about 850, and he's trying to sort of defend traditionalist poetic theory. And he, and especially these two pupils of his, this guy Induraja, who writes a commentary on Udbhata's work, and another pupil, Sahadeva, who writes an unpublished commentary on Vamana's Kavya Alankara Sutra and Virthi, which is a work I'll look at considerably later on. They're both kind of dredging through the pre-Anandavardhana Alankara literature to try and create a kind of theory that shows that basically Alankara talk can take care of all these forms of literary suggestion. It's something of a simplification, but. So Induraja has one reference to Dandin, and this is, he references that verse that we've already talked about, Limpativa Tamongani. The darkness seems to smear the limbs, and the sky seems to rain down collyrium, and one's vision becomes useless like service to bad people. I won't give you the Sanskrit unless you want it, but probably most of you are familiar with it by now. And he says, this is in the section on upama, he discusses it, and he says that basically you can't have upama of verbs with verbs. And he gives some grammatical theory to justify this. He quotes Patanjali, but he also quotes Dandin. He says, therefore, Dandin says, as Dandin, and therefore Dandin says that this verse, Limpatima Tamongani, he explains at great length that this is a type of atishayokti, right? So it's not a simile. So that's all he has to say about it. This other student of Mukulabhatta, Sahadeva, I'll talk about later, has a lot more to say about Dandin in interesting ways. Briefly, a couple more sort of tangential usages. That in later works in the Kashmiri tradition, Mamata and Ruyika, you occasionally see Dandin's example verses cited. And wherever this is the case, it's very clear that the citation is made with not knowing reference to Dandin's theory. That's, even though they don't quote the definition, it's very clear from the sort of alankaras they assign things to and the way they talk about them that they know that this is Dandin. Dandin's examples are not being circulated as kind of basically anthologized verses. They're sort of remembered as parts of a work of theory. Couple brief examples. Well, the only examples there are, but. So one is this example verse that we saw yesterday. Dandin gave us the translation of it. This verse where, as I was about to fall at the feet of my beloved to remove her anger, by good fortune, this thunder from a cloud rose up as if to assist me. So this is for Dandin an example of samahita, which I've translated as Dandin said actually coincidence, which actually in this instance, for certain reasons we'll look at later, might be a bit better. But this is a figure that's in Bhamaha, but Bhamaha doesn't define it. He only gives an example, and what the example is supposed to exemplify is not clear. So the Kashmiris and Dandin sort of interpret it, let's say Udbhata among the Kashmiris, and Dandin interpret this verse as different ways. Dandin takes it to be this sort of fortunate coincidence, and Udbhata takes it to be the subsidence of some emotional effect. I won't get more deeply into it than that. But Mamata has an ankara that he calls samadhi. This is a different grammatical form, but it's from the same root. And he quotes Dandin's example, the same example, about falling down at the wind's feet and the thunder comes along to help. And he defines this figure samadhi as a task, a karya that's easily done because of the connection with some other cause. So some sort of secondary cause comes in to help you. This looks nothing like Udbhata's definition of samadhi, and it clearly descends from Dandin. and seems to do so directly, not via some intermediary. So the example comes as part of a package, right? Bringing Dandin's example brings his version of the figure Samahita into Mamata. One other occurrence in Mamata, which is, this is this verse which Dandin gives as an example of a type of Atishayokti. The verse is, Aho vishalam bhupala bhuvana tritai udaram mati matum ashakyopi yashorashir yadatrate. So it's amazing, O king, that the wealth of your fame, the sort of expanse of your fame is so vast that even though it can't be measured, it can somehow find space for itself within these three worlds. Right? That it should be too big for the universe, but somehow it fits. This is what's amazing. And Mamata does not call this Atishayokti, he calls it Adhika. And this is actually a figure that was newly created not by Mamata but by this fellow named Rudratu, who was probably a Kashmiri, probably mid-800s, or early to mid-800s, we don't know exactly. But Mamata is clearly following, theoretically, Rudrata and not Dandin, but the example that he uses is Dandin's example. Right? So it's sort of been repurposed from Atishayokti to this different figure. Adhika basically is a sort of spin-off figure. It's just any time something's too big for what it's in, to simplify it a bit. Okay. So similarly in Ruyeke, who's kind of arguably, depending on your criteria, one of the last, if not the last, of the great Kashmiri Alankara theorists, about mid-1100s. And he also has two quotations from Dandin. One is one of the same examples again, actually. It's the Mana Masyaha verse. Just a sec. Oh, no, it's the Aho Fishalam verse, I'm sorry. Which he keeps in the category of Atishayokti, the one about how can your fame find room in the whole universe. So, so he retains the sort of earlier Dandin, but also Udbata category of Atishayokti and keeps this figure there, but using again Dandin's example. I don't want to run out of time, so maybe I will skip the other. The other thing is when he's explaining what Rupaka, what metaphor is, Ruyeke has this sort of idea of this gradation of similitude-based figures based on whether the difference between the subject and standard of comparison is equivalent, they're equally similar and different, or there's more difference, or there's more similarity. And he wants to say that Rupaka metaphor is just the sort of where the non-difference is highlighted and the difference is suppressed. And in support of this, he quotes actually Dandin's definition of Rupaka, which several other people, as we'll see, quote, or one at least. Upamaeva tirobhuta beda rupakam ishyate. So Rupaka really is just a simile with the difference suppressed. So he quotes this in support of his notion of the relation between Upama and Rupaka. Okay. So this is pretty typical. So you have pretty much throughout the sort of golden age of Kashmiri aesthetics from probably the late 9th century on until the mid-12th, you have these regular but rare citations or references to Dandin which show that he was still in circulation, that people still knew him, even though most of the time they say nothing about him and have nothing to do with him. So there's really only two figures I found who substantively engage with Dandin repeatedly. And these are Kuntaka, kind of a quirky fellow, who wrote this work called the Vakrukti Jivita in probably late 900s, a little bit before Abhinavagupta, probably. And this is it's kind of extending in some ways the tradition of the suggestion theory of Anandavarna, but in rather different terminology. It's trying to kind of assimilate all earlier poetic discussions to this, what he calls a new phenomenon, what he calls vakrokti, sort of twisted or somehow non-normal expression. Expression that so poetic expression is defined by its deviation from laukika, ordinary speech, at a phonetic level, at morphological, morphological word level, sentence level, and sort of whole composition level. Different forms of deviation. It's a pretty ill-defined category, and it's become something of a grab bag. In some ways, I think that Kuntika's method has certain affinities to Dandin's in that he is more interested in setting up these kind of loose, open-ended categories that can be expanded, and he doesn't want to pin everything down. He also, like Dandin, very often says, you can imagine more types of this for yourself, which nobody else in the world of Kashmiris ever does. They want to say, this is exactly how many types of upama there are, period. So he will often say, here's a few examples of this type of vakrata at the word level, and you can find others, or you can imagine others, or you can see others in practice. So he deliberately gestures sort of kind of theoretical open-endedness. Despite, I think, this sort of methodological continuity with Dandin, most of his references to Dandin are critical. And the vast majority of them occur in connection with this small group of kind of emotional content-related figures that have been sort of controversial since they were first set forth in Bama, at least first, that we were able to detect. This is a figure, rasa vat, which just means possessing rasa. And in the early Alankara works, this was the only manifestation of rasa that there was. Later on, post-Anandavardhana, there's this idea that there is sort of regular rasa, where a play has a dominant rasa. That's just rasa. That's not an Alankara. That's not a figure of speech. But then there's also this figure of speech, rasa vat, where rasa is somehow there, but as a subordinate element, not as the main thing, therefore as an ornament. Kuntika somewhat anachronistically tries to read some of this theory back into earlier discussions, but he's very interested in criticizing the idea that there can be a figure, an alankara, an ornament called rasavat. And he basically attacks this idea in two ways. One of which is at a very grammatical level to say rasavat means the figure that possesses rasa. If the figure possesses rasa, what is the figure? He says there's no possible referent for the figure. So you either have to say the rasa itself is the figure, in which case you can't call it possessing rasa, it just is rasa. Or you have to posit, without any evidence, some other thing which possesses the rasa and which ornaments the poem. So on grammatical grounds, he goes through all possible permutations of this theory, including a very interesting discussion of what if we take rasa vat to mean like rasa or as if rasa, the different kind of vat in Sanskrit that doesn't mean possessing. But at any rate, he goes through all the definitions and all the examples of rasavat given by what he calls the chirantanas, the ancients, or the old guys. And this, for him, very clearly, explicitly is Bhamaha, Udbata, and Dandin. And he quotes Dandin's example, his example for Shringar, which is the first of the rasas he gives, and his definition. Now, he quotes the definition. Interestingly, it's different from the definition we have, as far as I can tell, in any printed edition or attestation I can find. He says that Dandin defines these three figures. A figure called prayas, affection, rasavat, possessing rasa, and urjasvi, kind of bold, or something like that, in a single verse. And you can give examples. It's what we have, I think, in all printed editions, is rasavat, rasapeshalam, preyo, priyatarakyanam, rasavat, rasapeshalam, rudahankaram, urjasvi, yuktutkarsham to tattrayam. I think that's right. That affection is an affectionate statement. These are all sort of tautological definitions. Rasavat, possessing rasa, means sort of tender with rasa. And urgency, what do we call it? Sort of proud or is where there's sort of dense, rich pride. And they all have to be intensified. Again, this is the idea that these are normal emotions, but when they're carried to a certain level of intensity, they become figures, they become ornaments. So Kuntika quotes the fragment of the verse where he defines rasa. He says, but his first version of this is rasavat rasa samshrayat. It becomes very clear later on that this is a reading he has, and what he takes to be the standard reading of Dandin's definition. I couldn't find any attestation of this anywhere else. I don't know if anybody has. I'd be very interested to see it. But he first attacks this. So the figure rasavat exists because of the residence or existing of rasa in the poem, basically. And he attacks this for the reasons I just said, that there is no thing in which the rasa resides. Basically what he says is that these emotions are not ornaments. They're just the substance of the poem. They are the alankarya, the thing to be ornamented, or just the vastu, the sort of subject matter. They are not ornaments of anything. They are the thing that is to be ornamented. So he attacks this definition, but then he says, even if you accept the variant reading, patantara, rasa peshalam, this is the reading we actually have in all versions of the text that I was able to find. So basically the same problem. right? He doesn't have anything theoretically to add. But the fact, I think, that he can refer to this fragment of a verse from Dandin without attribution, he can refer to variant readings as if he expects the readers to know them, means that people really are assumed to have an intimate familiarity with Dandin's text, even though it's very rarely cited. So he just assumes that his reader, and there's one point later on explicitly where this becomes clear. So how am I for time? Okay. So I may summarize a bit. Basically, he does a similar kind of critique of the other two figures defined in that verse, Preas and Urjasvi. In the Preas one, he quotes Dandin's definition and the example verse that Dandin gives, and basically makes the same critique, that it can't be an alankara. There's nothing to be ornamented. The affection is the ornament. And again, he quotes Dandin and Udbata and Bama and demolishes them all. So he's not partisan between them in that way. And for Urjasvi, for some reason, he doesn't quote the definition. He only quotes the example while he's trashing all three of these guys. I'm not sure why. But then a few other points. There's another figure which Udbata seems to put in the sort of emotion-based figure category. This figure, his version of Samahita, which is the subsidence of emotion for him. And Kuntaka, as part of his campaign to extirpate all these emotion-based figures, he demolishes that on the same grounds. But he sort of, as a side, he demolishes Dandin's version of Samahita too, this coincidence or happenstance or serendipity. And he quotes Dandin's definition and his example, this one that we already saw, when I was about to fall down at my girlfriend's feet to remove her pride. And makes the same argument that this is the substance of the verse, it's not an alankara. That seems less clear why that should be the case if this figure is not about emotions anymore, but I don't think he has a strong argument there. He's kind of trying to clear house. It's interesting that he also, somewhat like Dandin, he's conservative in his categories. Well, it's not so much like Dandin, because Dandin wants to preserve the sit list. He wants to pare things down. So he wants to get rid of all these rasa and emotion-based figures. He also wants to get rid of these figures called Hetu and Lesha, which Bama is already attacking these figures. Dandin supports them. And Kuntaka quotes Bama's critique of these, and he quotes Dandin's examples and says they're no good, they're not alankars. So all of these so far are critical references to Dandin. But then, one very interesting case, but immediately after he gets rid of Hetu and Lesha, he also turns around then on Bama and says Bama has this figure called Upamarupa, a kind of hybrid, and he says that's also not a figure. So it's not that he's championing Bama over Dandin. He wants to pare down the list of figures as much as he can, and he's willing to pair both of them. But he very much has Dandin in his sights, among other people. But interesting place where he really refers to Dandin with approval and actually really cites him as an authority is later on in his discussion of Utpreksha. He yet again quotes that verse, Limpativa Tamongani. He quotes this as a kind of Utpreksha, and then he, without naming the source, but it's obviously, he expects you to know it's Dandin. But then he says, so the enumeration of particles such as iva that can express Utpreksha, this figure of whatever we want to call it, fancy, have already been set forth by Dandin, Dandina Vihitam, and therefore are not made again. So basically, he's referring you to Dandin as a source for more detailed discussion of this figure, which is the only time he refers to him by name. And it's the only time I've found anybody in Kashmir referring to Dandin as an authority. Not citing him as a parallel case, but actually saying you can go and read about this in Dandin. So it's very interesting to me that he does this, and that's of course when he chooses to name him, when he's positively engaging with him. So that's Kuntaka. In general, it seems like the way he deals with Dandin especially in the emotion-based figures, he's trying to be as thorough as possible. He's really trying to go through all discussions of Rasavad, including later ones from Anna the Varden and other people. He wants to show there's no way you can make this figure work on any understanding, on any definition. So as part of a bigger package, he's attacking Dandin, but he's not singling Dandin out for attack. And again, at least in that one case, he's willing to sort of see Dandin as a perfectly respectable authority on certain matters about Utpreksha. Okay. The less known case, and maybe the more interesting one, maybe it's not more interesting, I think it's probably more representative, is this fellow I mentioned, Sahadeva. And I think I can finish this okay. So Sahadeva, he wrote this commentary. It's the oldest commentary available on Vamana's Kavya, Alankara Sutra, and Virti, which were written around the same time as Udbata, around 800. Commentary is written probably around 900 or a little bit after. And interesting, in the introduction, he says that Vamana, the manuscript tradition of Vamana was Brashta Amnayam. It was sort of broken off. The tradition was broken. And Mukulabhatta, his guru, recovered Dandin from obscurity. This is less than 100 years after Vamana wrote. Vamana recovered Vamana from obscurity. So Mukulabhatta recovered Vamana from obscurity and kind of restored it. And I'm writing a commentary on it now. So he sees, again, this is what I said before, that Mukul is trying to sort of resurrect and kind of make coherent this whole tradition. So that other fellow I mentioned before, Induraja, Mukula's other pupil, in his commentary on Udbata, he kind of quotes a lot of Vamana and Rudrata, these other early figures, and tries more or less to harmonize them. There are some places where the harmonization doesn't work very well. But he's trying to sort of generate a common kind of traditionalist front. That's much less evident in Sahadeva. Sahadeva quotes Dandin usually neither as an opponent or as a sort of authority, but just as a kind of other. And he actually calls him Anya most of the time. That's all he says about him, usually. So let me just look at a couple examples briefly. So both Kuntaka and Sahadeva, they only quote Dandin, or refer to Dandin in connection with Alankaras. Kuntaka does so only in connection with Artha Alankaras, as do Mamata and Riyaka. Sahadeva has one quotation of Dandin in the Shabda Alankara section, but everything else is in the Artha Alankara section, and specifically in connection with what Vamana calls Upama Prapancha. Vamana has this makes a very interesting effort to say that all meaning-based figures are permutations of the simile. And he kind of twists and changes a lot of definitions to make this work. It's kind of an interesting project that goes nowhere. Nobody picks him up on it. But with the one exception of this one Shabda Alankara verse that he quotes, all of Sahadeva's references to Dandin are in that Upama Prapancha section. So the Shabda Alankara one I don't want to deal with too extensively, but there's a place where Vamana says you shouldn't repeat the same word too often. And as an example of the kind of thing you shouldn't do, Sahadeva cites it's Dandin 3.50, at least in Rajshri's edition. It's not the last of the yamakas, but it's kind of the last of the really kind of extensive multiple yamakas. It goes kala kala, guru kala kala, etc. It's got the word kala about 50 times, and I won't read the whole verse for you or attempt to interpret it. But he just as a snide says, this is what you don't do. So it's a verse from Dandin, which for Dandin is a good verse, dushkara, but theoretically acceptable. And he says this is an example of what Vamana means when he says don't use the same word too often. Okay. More interesting is what we get in the Artha Alankara section. So in the definition of this is in the not the Upama Prapancha, but Upama itself. So he's just commenting on the terms Upama and Upameya, and he brings in this question which we've already seen before of prasiddhi, that Upama and the Upameya are not arbitrarily chosen. As Andrew said on Monday, or Sunday, whenever it was, there's certain things we just know. We know that the moon's is the Upamana and the face is the Upameya, and not the other way around. And to justify this, he quotes from Dandin the definition of an example of what Dandin calls viparyasa upama, kind of inverted upama, where you invert the normal prasiddhi. Dandin's example is, I won't read the Sanskrit, but the lotus, when it opened, became like your face. This is called inverted upama, inverted simile, since it inverts conventional understanding. Yeah, he uses the word prasiddhi in the verse. So the point is, when you compare a lotus to a woman's face and not the other way around, you're inverting our normal expectation. So it's very interesting that he cites this from Dandin to show that prasiddhi is kind of basic to the upamana-upameya relation. But he doesn't want Dandin to be implicitly including the category of viparyasa upama. Dandin doesn't have such a, Vamana, doesn't have such a category. And he's not saying there's anything wrong with what Vamana is doing. He's not saying Vamana needs to be supplemented. Nor is he saying that Dandin is wrong and there shouldn't be such a category. It's just, he says, what does he say? He says, for this reason, Anyo, another person, has declared this thing called Vipriyasa Upama. And again, Anyo, I want to suggest this is kind of typical of the Kashmiri relation to Dandin, that he's just another, right? He's neither necessarily valued or devalued. He's kind of another way one might do things, but not the way we do things. A couple similar examples. Vamana talks about how there's Padartha Upama and Vakyartha Upama, a Vakyartha compared with a Vakyartha. And just as a parallel to this, Sahadeva says, Anya Aha, another person says, again Dandin says, if some sentence meaning is compared, this is 243 of Kavyadarsha, if some sentence meaning is compared with another sentence meaning, that is Vakyartha Upama, sentence meaning Upama, which is twofold depending on whether there are one or several ivas, one or several words like used. Okay. And again, when he's describing Rupaka metaphor as a permutation of simile, he like Ruyaka later on, he quotes this definition of Rupaka from Dandin. Upamaeva tiro bhuta bheda Rupakam ishyate. So Rupaka is just simile itself in which difference is suppressed. Right, so not exactly citing Dandin as authority, but as a sort of upodbalana, we would say in Sanskrit, a sort of, reinforcing parallel case from Dandin. Now then we get to Samahita. Now Vamana has his version of Samahita, which is not the same as anybody else's version of Samahita. This is this figure that's either serendipity or it's the subsidence of an emotion, or in Vamana he has to make it into a kind of simile. Seemingly out of the blue, just based on the etymology of the word, he takes it to be kind of like, I think, becoming or accomplishing a certain state. He says that Samahita is when the Upameya actually becomes the Upamana. The example verse that he gives is from the Vikram Urvashiya, where Pururavas is saying, boy, this creeper certainly looks like Urvashi, and the creeper is Urvashi who's been turned into a creeper. So the thing that you're using as the Upamana actually has already been turned into the Upameya without your knowing it, at least in that example. And Sahadeva just notes the theoretical disparity with Dandin. Interesting, he doesn't note the theoretical disparity with Udbada. But he says, Samahita si upama prapanchatam yojayitumaha. In order to justify or explain the idea that Samahita is a permutation of a simile, he states his definition, which I won't translate. Paramatehi, for in the view of another, that is to say Dandin, this is understood in a different way, as is said there in Dandin. He quotes the same verse again. He quotes the definition and the example of Samahita from Dandin, where I'm about to fall down at the feet of my girlfriend to remove her anger, and the thunder comes and scares her. Okay. So those are all of his references to Dandin, and just, how many for time? Okay. So yeah, to conclude briefly, my feeling is that even though Sahadeva is much more overt and substantive about it than most other people, that this basic attitude that he expresses, that Dandin is just something different, something other, is kind of the prevailing attitude. So Dandin is not somebody we have to attack as a threat, nor is he somebody we support. He's doing different things, and implicitly they don't talk about why he's doing what he's doing, but he just has a different sort of agenda. It's not our kind of thing. There is actually one more little example, which is not actually a quotation of Dandin. It may or may not specifically refer to Dandin. It's in Mahimabhatta's Vyakti Viveka, written about 1050. There's one part where he quotes this verse from the Raghuvamsha. Sanchar putani digantarani. Not going to try. Thank you. Yeah. Give me a sec, I'll find it. Prabhapatangasya Manushchadenuhu. Okay. So Mahavibhata happens to quote this verse for reasons of his own that I won't get into, and he calls it a Deepika. And Ruyika, the same Ruyika who wrote this Ankara work I referred to before, commenting on this, he's troubled by this. Well, this is like, nowadays, contemporary people, Adunikas, don't call this Deepika. They call it Atulya Yogita, and he means Udbata very clearly in this case. And he says that when Mahavibhata says this, he's referring to the view of the Chirantanas. He uses that word. And the Chirantanas basically says, don't make that same differentiation about context. And he could be referring to Bama or Dandin equally well, but it's this same kind of, and I've written a little bit about this example elsewhere, that he's not saying that the Chirantanas are wrong and we're smarter now and we're better, nor is he saying the Chirantanas were right and we've introduced this useful innovation. There's this kind of implicit relativization here, that we do what we do now, and it makes sense and it works for us, and we have cogent reasons for doing what we do, but other people do things differently. And I think whether he's marked as an ancient, archaic author or just Anya, just somebody different, basically this is how Kashmiris deal with Dandin. He's just something else. Okay. Yeah.
Two quick questions. Are there Dandin manuscripts in Sharda?
Not to my knowledge. Dragomir would be the person to ask probably. No.
That's one way to check whether
Yeah.
it was in circulation in the Kashmiri region.
Yeah.
That's one. It is on. It says it's on.
Well, we can hear, right? Can we all hear?
I have a big voice anyway. The second one is, I had a similar feeling with regard to Medhati, who wrote in Kashmir at about the same time. He doesn't refer to anybody.
Right.
And he cites people anonymously.
Yeah.
Is this a Kashmiri trait rather than a conscious, rejection of other people?
Maybe I've spent a long time reading Kashmiris, but it seems to me like it's a pretty pan-Shastric trait that people very often quote people anonymously, or somebody says it's a Kashchit. And my feeling is that almost always, with very rare exceptions, they expect you to know who it is. It's not that they don't care about the source. They assume that you'll know the source. And this is a sort of stylistic, rhetorical gesture, But my general assumption is that when people make quotations like that, the audience is assumed to know where it comes from. I think ensuing discussions often show that people did know. That's my feeling, but I can't prove it.
Okay, all right, thanks.
But I don't think it's distinctively Kashmiri. I don't know if anybody else has any feelings on that.
What I found is that even when he's citing Smritis,
Yeah,
he does not say the Yanvarkya.
yeah.
He just cites it.
But it wouldn't make any sense to cite scripture without regard to its source. Obviously, it only works as a scripture if people know what the source is, even if it doesn't need to be said. It goes without saying. Okay.
Thank you, Larry. I have a question. In the Kavi Raja Marga, it's interesting that whereas in the third chapter, rasa is treated as an artha alankara. In the second chapter, it's interesting that he often links it up with particular kinds of word choices and usages. For example, he'll say, Avira rasa is with prasada or sputita or karuna rasa is with udara.
You said that yesterday, and I mean, in Kashmir land, it's with Anandavardhana again. He is the one who first really clearly, explicitly links gunas and the ritis that are generated by these gunas with rasas. And he says, what gunas really do is they augment certain rasas, and that's the whole basis for use of gunas.
So he also links it up, Shri Vijay also links it up with the Uttara and the Dakshina Margas. So that's also, Anandavardhana also links it up with the Margas?
I mean, he doesn't talk so much about Margas, but implicitly, yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Their basic strong poetry, they got lots of ojas, which is like Gaudiya kind of poetry, is for Raudra and Veera and I forget, Bionica.
So that suggests perhaps that this Kannada text in some ways is actually aware of a much broader
that had occurred to me when you said that
tradition
yesterday.
in addition to Dandin. So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. This is a great overview of well, some of the terms that you used, is he Anya? Is he just different? Is he Chirantana? I'm still, I don't want to think of Dandin as just another guy that could be, that's basically neutral.
Yeah.
I mean, old is not gold in this case. There's something outmoded about the way that Dandin is operating, and I wonder, I mean, or maybe you wouldn't go so far.
It's a case-by-case thing. For Abhinavagupta in the Rasa theory, clearly true. For, I mean, I think that for Kuntaka, when he's talking about the Rasavad, etc., it's a descriptive term, which is why he can sort of trash Rasavad Alankara, but then turn around and use Dandin when he's talking about Upreksha. I think Chirantanta for him is a descriptive term. And for Ruyika, I really think that it is this, in that one example that I gave you at the very end, that it is, he's treating it in totally relativistic terms. He's pointedly going out of his way not to suggest that either the older or the newer view is a better view.
Well, these are issues of the theory of Alankara Shastra, right? So what gets to be included, what are the criteria for... There's operational differences as well, and I was wondering if the way of writing Alankara Shastra has changed, and people know it to have changed. So for instance, all of the Kashmiris, starting with Udpata and Anandavardhana, cite Sanskrit in the wild. They don't, I mean, not all of them, but this is a big trend, and I wonder whether this is one of the things that makes Dandin kind of, it's kind of like the way we think of structural linguistics.
Yeah,
or structuralism.
it's artificial. It's not based on the real world.
Yeah.
I have never seen anybody overtly reflect on that shift. Bahama, of course, does occasionally quote real existing verses from the wild, and Dandin does so once at least, the Limpati and Tamangani. I've never seen anybody in the tradition talk about that difference. Obviously, later on when you get these sort of Yashabhushana kind of texts, people say, I'm going to illustrate poetry, but I'm going to use it for the only real purpose that it's worth using it for, which is to glorify my particular patron, right? But other than that, I've never seen any sort of discussion or theorization of using made-up examples versus using real ones. Obviously, with Udbata and Vamana, you have a very marked shift to exclusively using real examples. But I've never seen that made a mark of credit or discredit. Obviously, people can sort of criticize the applicability of definitions to certain real examples, whether the person used a real example or not. Right? You can say that nobody does, because I think the examples I gave you are all the examples there are of explicit quotations of Dandin. But you can criticize somebody's definition and say it doesn't apply to this verse, and you can do that whether they cited a real example or not. As long as you can say there's another example that doesn't fit. We want this verse to be an example of this figure, and your definition doesn't make it work. A huge amount of the later discussion is built exactly around this. Can you find an example anywhere in the world of practice that doesn't fit this definition? And if you can, do you have to change the definition, or do you have to invent another figure to deal with this unassimilable example? But I don't think that issue is a particularly sensitive one, and I don't think people sense, or at least consciously exhibit any sense of an evolution in the field in exemplification terms that I've ever noticed.
Larry, thank you so much. I think your talk helps us a lot to think of the why Dandin question, because Kashmir pretty much moved away from Dandin for some of the reasons that other traditions
didn't move towards him. Let's not assume they were ever there.
Yeah. So we're talking about a period where Sanskrit literary theory in Kashmir is moving away from two of the salient features that mark Dandin's text, right? The Alankaras in their own right as the kind of the main thing that the tradition does.
Well, that's not true for Udbata at all. He's all about Alankaras, even more than that.
Just 1 second. And from a writerly perspective to a readerly perspective. And so the tradition comes, as you said, to see Dandin as something else. And then we see in the Kaviraja Marga, for example, there is knowledge of what's going on in Kashmir, but it's not the main model they're working from. So it's a fascinating contrast. So there is a kind of as you said, there's a kind of an oppositional group of writers even within Kashmir
Yeah.
to this trend, and they make more use of Dandin, but everybody is treating him as something else. Now, within this, what I want you to so my first question is, within this, where is Bamaha? In terms of doctrine, Dandin and Bamaha are pretty much the same something else, but the treatment of the Kashmiris to both of them is not the same, and I'm interested that I want you to say one word on this.
Okay, can I say it now, or do I have to wait?
No, let me finish.
Okay.
And then I just want to say just two comments. I want to protest the beginning of the golden age.
Okay.
At
thank
the
you.
late 9th century, the golden age of Kashmir. I think the golden age of Kashmir begins.
Oh, did I say that?
Yeah. I think the golden age of Kashmir begins with Vamana and Udbata.
No, I agree completely. If I said that, I was wrong.
Okay.
You're right. I'm
Okay.
sorry if I said that.
And then I wonder why you did not speak of Vamana in this context, because Vamana makes a lot of usage of Dandin. I don't know what you call an explicit quotation, but there are unmistakable quotations.
Okay. This is. I can address that.
Okay.
Let me start with the other one, which is simpler. I think you and I both know exactly the reason Bama has treated differentially from Dandin in Kashmir, and its name is Udbata, right? Udbata, who is the real author of this golden age and the founder of this Kashmiri cognition-centered tradition. I think we agree completely on this. He chooses to build on the model of Bamaha and not Dandin. And once he's made that choice, people read Bamaha through the lens of Udbata, almost without exception. And when people talk about the old Alankargas, what do they say? In Kashmir, they say Bamaha Udbata for birthday, almost without exception. That's the standard formulation. So just Udbata, by making that choice, has created this parampara, which kind of grandfathers in Bamaha, and whatever is archaic and weird, and you've unearthed more of this than anybody else, whatever is archaic and weird in Bamaha and doesn't fit with what's going on in the post-Udbata world, people just kind of brush under the carpet or ignore. Basically, they assume that Udbata knows what he's doing. And the really important work here, as I don't need to tell you, is Udbata's commentary in Bhamana, which we only have in extremely fragmentary form. It's very clear that, at least until Anandavardhana's time, and probably long after, this was really the most important work of Alankara Shastra in Kashmir. It's the real founding document. Okay. Vamana and Rudrata, they do not quote Dandin at all, but they are both in different ways processing bits of stuff from Dandin. I wanted to focus on this paper on direct quotations and citations. There's a quotation where he says blah 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 iti, and it's the same words. If you find actual verbatim parallel passages in Vamana, so then maybe I'm missing something, and you probably know more about this than I do. I think there's no question that Vamana and Rudrata are self-consciously reprocessing bits of Dandin, although they're also adversarial to him in significant ways. I think this would be another topic. I think that despite the efforts of Mukula and his pupils, I think that Vamana and Rudrata are both kind of internal outsiders in the Kashmiri tradition. That Udbata really becomes the kind of, the path blazer, and most of the later work assumes him as the norm. Even works that attack him, like Ananda, when he thinks of the traditional view, he thinks of Udbata first and foremost. So I think that Vamana and Rudrata, who do sort of Dandinize their poetics a bit, the Dandinized elements generally don't get picked up. The one exception is Mamata, who really does, not so much from Vamana, but from Rudrata, a lot of these kind of expanded figures, like things that are permutations of figures in Dandin that turn out to be, are developed into full figures in Rudrata, get picked up by Mamata. That's true. And how much Mamata thinks of that going back to Dandin is not clear. Obviously, he does know Dandin, so it's quite possible he's conscious, but I think he's consciously reprocessing Rudrata much more than he is Dandin. And if you looked, there are two of Dandin's Udaharnas pop up in the Kavya Prakasha. The number of examples he picks up from Rudrata is like more by a factor of 10 or more. Lots and lots of Rudrata verses are incorporated, again, almost always to exemplify what Rudrata took them to exemplify.
Would it be correct to say that everyone you've mentioned today has read Dandin and knew Dandin extremely well?
Well, everybody I mentioned today obviously quotes Dandin, I mean, Vamana and Rudra I just mentioned don't quote him, but obviously know him. Some of them you can document that they know them extremely well. My assumption is that most people knew him extremely well. I think especially that sort of the way that Quintica talks about the variant reading of that one definition of Rasavat, he's assuming that everybody basically has Dandin in their brain already. That they don't need to be told where it's from, they don't need to be told where to look, they just know it. They don't need to be given the name, they know that it's Dandin. I think that shows a background assumption that Dandin is part of what any educated person knows, even though he's very, very rarely referenced. That's what's really interesting. That is this sort of pregnant silence because it's clear that they all know him. Yeah, I mean, some cases it's harder to prove that some guy knows him really well, but he knows him at least some, enough to quote him. But I think the general evidence that Dandin was extremely well known in Kashmir, even when he's very rarely referenced, is unmistakable. Yeah.
Thank you for giving so much information. What I am wondering is, see, from 800 AD onwards, there is so much of literary activity in Kashmir. All the luminaries, Udbhata, Mamata, Abhinavagupta, Anandavardhana, Ruyaka, so many are there. Before that, we do not hear anything in the history of literature from Kashmir. How did this phenomenon occur there? Were there historical reasons, political reasons, social reasons? How it became the center of all this poetic activity? How can we understand this phenomenon?
I think it's very clear. Yigal has written on this, but it's money. Very simple. In Kashmir, I mean, it is politics and money. That under Lalita Aditya and later Jaya Aditya, Kashmir expanded a great deal, became much more militarily powerful, economically powerful, and especially Jayapida, and Yigal is the real authority on this, initiated a vast program of funded Brahmanical learning. We know that Brahmanas from all over India flocked in exactly that time to India. Abhinavagupta, Jayantapata, they all trace their ancestry back to somebody who came from somewhere else to Kashmir right exactly in the time of Jayapida. It's very clear. Grammar was revived in a massive way at the same time. This is discussed in detail in the Raja Tarangini. So I think we have a massive investment of royal funds in certainly grammar and poetics and poetry, and a lot of other fields too, it seems. And I think that Kashmir just became the place that any Brahmin who was hard up and any smart Brahmin would go. You know, it became a magnet. I think it's a straightforward case of patronage just generating a massive boom. I don't think there's any question about that.
So just as a kind of speculative question, we talked a lot about, you know, this comes from Bamaha or this comes from Dandin. And I'm thinking about specifically in Kashmir when we have a move in the form of Alankara Shastras, how Alankara Shastras get written from a kind of list of tropes describing them in certain ways to what Ananda does, and to then later what becomes the kind of touchstone, what Mamarta does. When we talk about linguistic theory first, then you do your tropes, and gunas and doshas. So I'm wondering here, do you see anything, do you think there was a, I can't think of, just a general structure of Alankara Shastra that is inherited that Dandin might be a part of rather than just saying Dandin, or Bamaha might be a part of rather than just saying Bamaha?
That guides that development,
Yeah,
or that is
no, that provides the framework for this Alankara or this Alankara-based way of organizing thought, and then Kashmir kind of toys with that. I guess I'm talking about the larger structures rather than just drawing specific parallels.
I mean, I could tell you a very detailed story, of which I'm totally confident, about how you get from Udbata, from whom everything is Alankaras. Udbata actually wants to reduce what for both Bamaha and Dandin is a more diverse field to one topic. There's only one thing in Alankara Shastra, and that's Alankara. He wants to reduce all gunas to sort of formal features. You know, basically, this is his reductionist idea. But, I mean, the real story of how you get to Mamanta and the sort of separate section on language theory in the beginning has to do with Anandavardhana. And Mamata basically wants to absorb the Alankara tradition and Anandavardhana in a single integrated structure, and he has to do some sort of theoretical jiggering around. And he sort of wants to absorb this guy Mukulabhatta, who really is essentially the author of chapter 2 of the Kavya Prakasha, most of it, almost word for word. So, I mean, Mamata, I think, wants to write this sort of summa, and he wants to incorporate as much as he consistently can of this whole body of basically Kashmiri theory with a little side of Dandin, but not much. He wants to absorb and integrate and reprocess as much as he can, even from rival work. So he incorporates huge amounts of Mahimabhatta, who's a rival of the Dwani theory. But as much as he can of his dosha theory, he can just import, and he does. And I think he sort of, I mean, so it's clear that the intentionality has changed. Udbutta wanted everything to be about Alankaras. Ananda, actually, I've pretty much argued, or certainly strongly suggested, Ananda really wanted to replace the theory of Alankaras with the theory of what he calls subordinated suggestion. That his discussion of Guni Bodhivyanga clearly is meant to basically displace and sort of repackage on Alankara analysis in terms of his big theory of suggestion. And Mamata wants to sort of keep both, even though they're meant to be kind of exclusive in a way. So he has a chapter on Guni Bodhivyanga and a chapter on Alankaras as if they were different things. You know, I mean, I could say a lot more about this if you wanted me to, but I don't know if that answers your question at all. I think different people at different moments have very different objectives, and if you look at the way they structure their works, you can often figure out what they are, but it's not a consistency, certainly, of formal intention. The forms change a lot, right? But I don't think you can tell a unitary story of a sort of linear development.
This is a question one really could direct at any of the papers, but maybe in this case, with hopes that, you know, by the time we're in Kashmir, we have a little bit more historical types of information and so on. Do we have any knowledge of curricula, of ways of learning, I mean, are there institutions in which people who are writing about literary theory are working, and do we have any idea of the sociology and so on?
Well, for this period in Kashmir, we essentially have one source of that sort, which is the Rajatarangini. On the basis of that, we can, assuming that the Rajatarangini is true all the time, which I think is an assumption people sometimes make too readily.
Can you just tell for those of us who don't know what is that work?
The Rajatarangini is often singled out as the only real history in traditional India. It's this historical account of the kings of Kashmir from the end of the Mahabharata, throughout the Kali Yuga up until the present day of the author, which is, you know, mid-1100s. Almost exactly contemporaneous with Riyaka, the latest of the people I mentioned. So it's this, you know, it's this long history which covers all the rules, and for the earlier periods it's largely kind of fanciful, and it gets much more detailed and much more seemingly realistic and plausible as it gets closer to the present. And we have a lot of data about who exactly was at whose court. So we know that, we don't know a detail about certainly the educational structure of the pedagogy, but we know that Udbutta and Vamana were at the court of this king Jayapita. We know that a generation or two later, Anandavardhana and a lot of other poets whose works we know only very incompletely were active at the court of this guy named Avantivarman. But there are other people for whom we know nothing explicit about their affiliations. A lot of people, most serious scholars in Kashmir, have this title Rajanaka, which is thought to be a sort of royally dispensed title. Whether that means they actually lived in the court and worked there, we don't know, right? So some people, we have very little information about their institutional setting. And some, we know when they were, and we know whose court they were at, but we don't know a lot more than that. I mean, Udbutta, we supposedly know how much he was paid, which was a lot.
But we know nothing of pedagogy, you know.
Only, as with most
study.
other periods in India, what you can infer from the practice.
Right.
Right, we have no records or documents or accounts of pedagogy, of poetry or poetics, do we? I mean, you would do better than I, but I don't think in any significant way. Certainly not of Alankara Shastra, maybe of poetry, but.
Yeah, I mean, just what inspired the question was, you know, it sort of reminds me, like in the study of religion, there are these classics in theory of religion, you know, Iliad and so on, that students have to learn. Then they may never cite that again. I just didn't know whether it was a sort of a, you know, but this is just me making stuff.
I mean, my gut feeling, I mean, as somebody who knows the Kashmiri literature extremely well, I will say, is that this is a kind of, this is kind of the world we all want to live in. It's a world in which anybody with significant intellectual potential can get funding to work, and they can write whatever the hell they want. And what determines their success or failure is the approbation of other intellectuals. I think there's very little indication of any kind of royal or other institutional thumb on the content of what people were writing. I think that people were writing, Alankarikas were writing for other Alankarikas. They were sort of competing for prestige and status and supremacy, you know, in the court of themselves. I don't think there's any reason to believe that there were sort of external institutional forces that were sort of lifting this guy up and pushing this guy down. Somebody may disagree, but that's my feeling.